Why the flesh hates prayer. The spiritual fight most Christians ignore. There is a battle taking place in every believer's life that most people rarely talk about. It is not a battle you see with your eyes, and it is not fought with weapons made by human hands. It is a quiet war that happens deep inside the human heart, a war between two forces that cannot coexist peacefully, the flesh and the spirit. Every Christian has felt this conflict at some point. You wake up in the morning with the intention of praying, but suddenly your mind feels heavy. You tell yourself you will pray later, but later never seems to come. When you finally try to pray, distractions appear out of nowhere. Your phone becomes interesting, your thoughts wander, and suddenly everything feels more urgent than speaking with God. This is not an accident. The resistance you feel toward prayer is not merely laziness, lack of discipline, or poor time management. It is something deeper, something spiritual, something that the Apostle Paul described centuries ago when he wrote about the constant war between the flesh and the spirit. The flesh hates prayer. It resists prayer. It avoids prayer. And it does everything possible to keep you away from it. Why? Because prayer weakens the flesh and strengthens the spirit. Prayer shifts authority. Prayer reconnects the believer with God. Prayer restores clarity, direction, and spiritual power. And the flesh knows that when a believer truly learns how to pray, its control begins to collapse. That is why many Christians attend church, read the Bible occasionally, and try to live moral lives, yet still struggle with consistent prayer. It is not because they do not love God. It is because the flesh is fighting to keep control. Scripture makes this conflict very clear. In Galatians 5:17, Paul wrote, "For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other." This conflict is not theoretical, it is practical. It shows up in daily life. It shows up when you try to worship, when you try to read Scripture, and especially when you try to pray. Prayer is one of the most powerful spiritual acts a believer can engage in. It is the moment when the human soul reconnects with its Creator. It is the place where burdens are released, wisdom is received, and strength is renewed. But prayer is also the place where the flesh loses its influence, and that is why the flesh fights it so fiercely. In this message, we will explore the hidden spiritual struggle behind prayer. We will uncover why the flesh resists it so strongly, why many believers feel a strange resistance when they try to pray, and how this unseen battle shapes the daily spiritual lives of Christians around the world. Most importantly, we will understand how believers can overcome this struggle and learn to walk in a deeper, stronger relationship with God. Because once you understand why the flesh hates prayer, you begin to recognize the battle for what it truly is. And once you recognize the battle, you can begin to win it. Prayer threatens the control of the flesh. The flesh is not merely the human body. In Scripture, the term flesh often refers to the fallen human nature, the part of us that gravitates toward comfort, self-interest, pride, and independence from God. It is the part of us that prefers control over surrender. It is the part of us that seeks pleasure over discipline. It is the part of us that resists submission to God's will. And prayer directly confronts this nature. Prayer is an act of surrender. When a believer prays sincerely, something powerful happens internally. The soul acknowledges that it cannot control everything. It recognizes its dependence on God. It admits weakness, need, and vulnerability. The flesh despises this. The flesh thrives on self-reliance. It wants the illusion of independence. It wants the believer to feel strong enough to handle life alone, but prayer destroys that illusion. When a believer kneels before God, they are essentially saying, "I cannot do this without you." That statement alone weakens the authority of the flesh. This is why many people find it surprisingly difficult to maintain a consistent prayer life. The resistance they feel is not simply psychological, it is spiritual. The flesh senses that prayer shifts power. When you pray, your focus moves away from yourself and toward God. Your problems, fears, and ambitions are placed before Him. Your desires begin to align with His will rather than your own impulses. And the flesh does not want that. The flesh prefers distraction. It prefers busyness. It prefers constant stimulation. Anything that keeps the believer from slowing down long enough to enter God's presence. Think about how often distractions appear the moment someone tries to pray. A sudden thought about work, a random memory, an urge to check the phone, a feeling of tiredness. These interruptions often seem small and harmless, but they can quietly prevent meaningful prayer from happening. Over time, the believer may begin to believe that prayer simply doesn't work for them, or that they are not good at praying. But the truth is that prayer is not supposed to be easy for the flesh, because prayer is where the Spirit begins to take authority. When Jesus spoke to His disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, He made a statement that reveals this truth clearly. In Matthew 26:41, He said, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." The disciples wanted to stay awake and pray with Him, but their flesh resisted. Their bodies felt heavy. Their minds struggled to remain focused. This moment reveals something important about human nature. Even people who genuinely love God will experience resistance when they try to pray. The problem is not their love for God. The problem is the flesh. The flesh fears losing control over the believer's life, and prayer is one of the fastest ways for the Spirit to regain authority. Because prayer opens the door for God's presence. It invites His guidance. It allows His voice to be heard above the noise of the world. And when that happens, the desires of the flesh begin to lose their influence. This is why consistent prayer changes people. Someone who truly develops a prayer life does not remain the same person for long. Their priorities shift, their attitudes change, their responses to temptation grow stronger. Prayer reshapes the inner life, and the flesh knows this, so it fights, it delays, it distracts, it whispers excuses. You're too tired. You can pray later. You've already prayed enough. But the truth is that these whispers are part of a deeper spiritual struggle. The flesh is trying to maintain its influence. Yet Scripture repeatedly reminds believers that victory is possible. James 4:8 says, "Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you." This promise reveals the power of prayer. When a believer chooses to approach God despite the resistance of the flesh, something supernatural happens. God's presence meets them in that moment. Strength replaces weakness. Clarity replaces confusion. Peace replaces anxiety. And slowly, the control of the flesh begins to fade. But this transformation does not happen automatically. It requires persistence. It requires discipline. It requires the believer to recognize the battle and choose the Spirit over the flesh again and again. Prayer is not simply a religious routine. It is a spiritual confrontation. It is the place where the believer declares that God, not the flesh, will have the final authority in their life. And that is exactly why the flesh hates it. Distraction. The flesh's favorite weapon against prayer. If there is one strategy the flesh uses more than any other to weaken a believer's prayer life, it is distraction. Rarely does the flesh attack prayer directly by saying, "Do not pray." Instead, it quietly fills the believer's mind and environment with so many competing thoughts, responsibilities, and noises that prayer slowly becomes crowded out. Distraction is subtle. It does not always appear as something sinful or obviously wrong. Most of the time it appears as something ordinary, something harmless, something that seems necessary in the moment, a message that needs answering, a task that needs finishing, a thought that suddenly feels urgent. Before the believer realizes what has happened, the moment for prayer has passed. This strategy is effective because the flesh understands something important about human nature. If a person can be kept constantly occupied, they will rarely have the stillness necessary to encounter God. Prayer requires attention. It requires the mind and heart to slow down long enough to focus on God's presence, but the flesh thrives in chaos, noise, and constant movement. The more restless the mind becomes, the harder it is to enter into meaningful prayer. This is why many people notice something strange when they finally try to pray. Their minds suddenly become incredibly active. Thoughts appear that they had not considered all day. Plans, worries, memories, and random ideas flood their attention all at once. It almost feels as if the mind refuses to stay still. Yet this phenomenon reveals the deeper struggle between the spirit and the flesh. When the believer begins to pray, the spirit is attempting to reconnect with God, but the flesh immediately responds by creating internal noise. The goal is simple: break the focus of prayer. This struggle is not new. It has existed throughout the history of faith. Even centuries before modern technology, believers described the same experience. Early Christian writers spoke about wandering thoughts during prayer as one of the most common challenges in spiritual life. The human mind naturally drifts when the flesh is in control. But the moment someone attempts to enter God's presence, the flesh senses the threat and begins to resist. It introduces distractions that seem impossible to ignore. Today, the environment of the modern world has made this battle even more intense. The average person lives surrounded by constant stimulation, notifications, messages, news updates, entertainment, and endless digital content compete for attention every minute of the day. The mind becomes trained to jump from one thing to another without rest. When someone tries to pray in this environment, they are suddenly asking their mind to do something it is no longer accustomed to doing. Remain still. The flesh resists that stillness. It resists silence. It resists reflection. Because silence creates space for God's voice, and the flesh does not want that voice to be heard. One of the most revealing examples of this battle appears in the life of Jesus himself. Throughout the Gospels, it is repeatedly mentioned that Jesus withdrew from crowds and distractions in order to pray. Luke chapter 5:16 tells us, "But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." This pattern is significant. If even Jesus chose to remove himself from the noise of daily activity in order to pray, it reveals how powerful distraction can be. Crowds, responsibilities, and constant interaction make deep prayer difficult. Jesus intentionally created distance from those distractions so he could commune with the Father. For believers today, the principle remains the same. Prayer becomes stronger when distractions are removed. But the flesh does not like that removal. The flesh prefers a life filled with constant input, constant noise, and constant activity. It thrives in environments where there is never a quiet moment, because in those environments, prayer becomes rare. Distraction also works in a deeper way than many people realize. It does not only affect the time set aside for prayer, it shapes the condition of the heart throughout the day. A distracted life produces a distracted spirit. When a believer spends hours absorbing endless information, images, conversations, and digital stimulation, their inner world becomes crowded. Their thoughts become scattered. When they finally attempt to pray, their mind continues operating at the same speed. The heart struggles to slow down. This is why prayer sometimes feels difficult after long periods of constant stimulation. The mind has been conditioned to move quickly and react constantly. Prayer invites the opposite rhythm. Prayer invites stillness. Prayer invites listening. Prayer invites surrender. And these are things the flesh naturally resists. Another reason distraction is such an effective weapon against prayer is that it rarely feels dangerous. Most distractions appear harmless. Checking a message or finishing a small task seems innocent enough. But when these small interruptions accumulate day after day, they slowly erode the believer's connection with God. Prayer becomes shorter. Moments of reflection disappear. The soul becomes spiritually dehydrated without realizing it. This is why spiritual disciplines are so important. Disciplines create intentional space where distraction loses its power. Setting aside a specific time for prayer helps the believer resist the pull of constant activity. Creating a quiet environment removes some of the external noise that feeds distraction. But the most important change happens internally. The believer begins to recognize distraction for what it truly is, a strategy that the flesh uses to maintain control. Once this awareness develops, the believer can respond differently. Instead of feeling discouraged when distractions appear during prayer, they understand that the struggle itself is part of the spiritual battle. Distraction is not proof that prayer is failing. It is proof that prayer matters. The very fact that the mind becomes restless when prayer begins shows that something significant is happening. The spirit is reaching toward God, and the flesh is resisting that movement. Understanding this truth changes how believers approach prayer. Instead of giving up when distractions appear, they gently return their focus to God again and again. Each return is an act of spiritual resistance. Each moment of refocusing strengthens the spirit. Each small victory weakens the hold of the flesh. Over time, this persistence transforms the believer's prayer life. The mind gradually learns how to settle. The heart becomes more attentive to God's presence. Prayer becomes less about perfect concentration and more about faithful returning. Returning when the mind wanders, returning when distractions appear, returning when the flesh tries to pull attention away. This returning is itself a form of spiritual discipline. It teaches the soul to choose God repeatedly despite resistance. And as that habit grows, something remarkable begins to happen. The believer becomes more aware of God throughout the day, not only during formal moments of prayer. The line between prayer and daily life begins to blur. The heart becomes more sensitive to God's presence in ordinary moments. This transformation weakens the power of distraction. Because once the spirit becomes accustomed to turning toward God, the noise of the world loses some of its influence. The believer learns how to pause internally, even in the middle of a busy day. They learn how to whisper short prayers between tasks. They learn how to return their attention to God, even when distractions surround them. This is how the battle against distraction is ultimately won. Not by eliminating every distraction in life, but by training the heart to return to God again and again. The flesh may introduce noise, but the spirit learns how to rise above it. And every time the believer chooses to pray despite the noise, the flesh loses a little more of its power. Because prayer is not simply words spoken to God. Prayer is an act of spiritual alignment. It is the moment when the believer chooses the spirit over the flesh. And every time that choice is made, the spirit grows stronger. The flesh fears the presence of God. One of the deepest reasons the flesh resists prayer is because prayer brings the believer into the presence of God. And the presence of God exposes everything the flesh tries to hide. The flesh survives through illusion. It thrives when a person remains spiritually distracted, emotionally numb, or mentally distant from God. In that state, a person can continue living according to their impulses without confronting the deeper condition of their heart. But prayer interrupts that illusion. When a believer enters genuine prayer, something begins to happen internally. The noise of life starts to fade, and the soul becomes aware of God's presence. In that awareness, things that were once ignored suddenly become visible. Attitudes are revealed, Motives are examined, hidden fears come to the surface, unconfessed sins begin to weigh on the conscience. The presence of God functions like a light entering a dark room. It does not create the dust or the disorder inside the room, but it makes those things visible. What once seemed acceptable suddenly appears out of place. The flesh hates this exposure. The flesh prefers darkness, not necessarily moral darkness in the dramatic sense, but the subtle darkness of spiritual neglect. It prefers a life where the believer is busy enough, entertained enough, or distracted enough that they never stop long enough to confront the true condition of their soul. Prayer removes that hiding place. When someone truly prays, they are no longer hiding from God. They are standing before Him, and standing before God requires honesty. This is why many believers feel uncomfortable during deep prayer. The discomfort is not caused by God's rejection, but by the sudden awareness of their own spiritual condition. The soul realizes it cannot pretend in God's presence. Psalm 139 captures this reality with powerful clarity. The psalmist writes, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me, and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." This prayer is both beautiful and terrifying. It invites God to examine the deepest parts of the human heart. It asks Him to reveal anything that is misaligned with His will, but the flesh does not want this examination. It resists the idea of being searched, exposed, and corrected. The flesh wants comfort without transformation. It wants forgiveness without repentance. It wants God's blessings without surrender. Prayer challenges all of that. In prayer, the believer stands before a holy God, not a distant force, not an abstract idea, but the living Creator who sees everything clearly. In that moment, the believer realizes that nothing can be hidden. This awareness can feel overwhelming at first, but it is also one of the greatest gifts of prayer, because exposure leads to healing. When God reveals something in the believer's heart, it is not to shame them, but to restore them. His presence brings conviction, but conviction is meant to guide the soul toward freedom. The flesh does not want that freedom because it would mean losing control. The flesh thrives on patterns that keep people spiritually weak. Pride, resentment, selfishness, and secret habits all function as small chains that bind the soul. As long as those chains remain hidden, they can continue influencing the believer's life. But in God's presence, those chains begin to break. Prayer brings light into hidden places, and light transforms what it touches. This is why consistent prayer changes a person over time. The transformation is often slow and subtle, but it is real. A believer who spends regular time in God's presence gradually becomes more aware of their thoughts, their words, and their actions. Their conscience becomes sharper, their sensitivity to sin increases, their desire for righteousness grows stronger. From the perspective of the flesh, this transformation is a threat. The flesh does not want the believer to become spiritually aware. It prefers spiritual numbness. It prefers a life where the believer goes through religious motions without truly encountering God. But prayer creates encounter with God's truth, encounter with His holiness, encounter with His love. And these encounters reshape the soul. Another reason the flesh fears God's presence is because God's presence brings authority. When someone spends time with God, they begin to understand His will more clearly. Their priorities start to shift. Decisions are no longer based solely on emotion or convenience. Instead, the believer begins asking a deeper question: what does God want? This question changes everything. It changes how a person treats others. It changes how they handle conflict. It changes how they respond to temptation. It even changes how they think about their purpose in life. Prayer realigns the believer with God's authority, and the flesh resists any authority greater than itself. The flesh wants autonomy. It wants to be the final voice in a person's life. But when someone prays regularly, that autonomy fades. God's guidance becomes stronger than personal impulse. This is why people who develop a strong prayer life often appear different from others around them. Their reactions become calmer. Their choices become more thoughtful. Their priorities become less centered on immediate gratification. They begin living with eternity in mind. And the flesh despises this shift. It prefers short-term thinking. It prefers emotional reactions. It prefers decisions driven by impulse rather than wisdom. But prayer slowly reshapes the believer's inner compass. The more time someone spends in God's presence, the more their desires begin to change. Things that once felt important begin to lose their grip. Ambitions rooted in pride or comparison start to feel empty. At the same time, deeper desires begin to grow. Desire for truth, desire for peace, desire to live in alignment with God's purpose. These changes are not forced through external pressure. They grow naturally through time spent with God. Just as spending time with certain people influences our attitudes and behaviors, spending time with God influences the soul. This is why the flesh tries so hard to avoid prayer, because it understands that consistent exposure to God's presence will eventually transform the believer. The flesh cannot maintain control in a life that is regularly shaped by God's voice. Prayer dismantles the illusions that keep the flesh comfortable. It reveals the difference between temporary pleasure and lasting joy. It reveals the difference between selfish ambition and divine purpose. It reveals the difference between worldly success and spiritual peace. And once a believer begins to see these differences clearly, the influence of the flesh begins to weaken. This is why some of the most powerful spiritual moments in a person's life happen during prayer. Moments when clarity suddenly arrives. Moments when a long-standing burden finally lifts. Moments when a difficult decision becomes obvious. Those moments are not coincidences. They are the result of entering God's presence, but reaching those moments requires perseverance. The flesh will continue resisting. It will continue introducing distractions, excuses, and fatigue whenever the believer tries to pray. Yet every time the believer chooses prayer despite that resistance, something important happens. They are choosing truth over illusion. They are choosing light over darkness. They are choosing God's presence over the comfort of the flesh. And with every one of those choices, the spirit grows stronger. Prayer weakens the power of temptation. Another reason the flesh hates prayer is because prayer weakens the power of temptation. The flesh survives through temptation. It feeds on impulses, cravings, emotional reactions, and desires that pull the believer away from God's will. Temptation is the environment where the flesh feels strongest. It thrives when a person acts quickly without reflection, when emotions override wisdom, and when impulses are followed without restraint. But prayer interrupts that cycle. Prayer slows the soul down. It creates a pause between impulse and action, and in that pause the believer begins to see things more clearly. The flesh does not want that clarity, because clarity exposes temptation for what it truly is. Many temptations appear powerful only when they are seen through the lens of immediate desire. In the moment, they seem satisfying, necessary, or even harmless. But when someone steps into prayer, their perspective changes. They begin to see the long-term consequences of choices that once seemed small. They recognize how certain behaviors slowly shape the direction of their life. The illusion of temptation begins to fade under the light of God's truth. This is why prayer is one of the strongest defenses against sin. It does not merely suppress temptation, it transforms the believer's perspective on temptation itself. When someone regularly seeks God in prayer, their inner world begins to shift. Desires that once felt overwhelming start to lose their intensity. Habits that once seemed impossible to break slowly weaken. This transformation does not always happen instantly. It often unfolds gradually through repeated encounters with God. Each moment of prayer strengthens the Spirit's ability to resist the pull of the flesh. Each conversation with God reshapes the believer's priorities. Each act of surrender weakens the chains that temptation tries to place around the heart. The flesh knows this, which is why it tries so hard to prevent believers from praying consistently. If the flesh can keep someone away from prayer, it can maintain its influence over their decisions. Without prayer, a person often lives reactively. They respond to emotions, circumstances, and external pressures without taking time to seek God's guidance. In that reactive state, temptation finds easy opportunities. Anger turns into harsh words, fear turns into compromise, desire turns into unhealthy habits. But prayer introduces awareness. Awareness breaks the automatic patterns that temptation depends on. When someone begins their day in prayer, they enter the day with a different mindset. They become more attentive to their thoughts and emotions. They become more sensitive to moments when temptation begins to appear. This awareness gives them the opportunity to respond differently. Instead of reacting automatically, they pause internally and remember God's truth. This is exactly what Jesus encouraged his disciples to do. In Matthew 26:41, he said, "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." This statement reveals a powerful connection between prayer and spiritual vigilance. Jesus did not simply tell his followers to resist temptation through willpower. He told them to pray. Prayer strengthens the spirit in ways that human determination alone cannot achieve. Willpower is limited because it depends on personal strength. Prayer draws strength from God himself. When a believer prays, they are not fighting temptation alone. They are inviting divine help into their struggle. This changes the nature of the battle. Temptation no longer feels like an isolated fight within the human mind. It becomes part of a larger spiritual relationship where God actively supports the believer's growth. The flesh hates this partnership because it cannot compete with God's strength. The flesh is powerful only when the believer relies solely on their own resources. But when someone consistently brings their struggles before God, new strength begins to emerge. This strength is not always dramatic or visible. Often it appears in quiet moments of self-control, a harsh word that remains unspoken, a harmful habit that loses its grip, a destructive thought that fades before it becomes action. These small victories are the fruit of prayer. They show that the Spirit is gaining authority over the flesh. Over time, these victories accumulate. The believer begins to notice that temptations that once dominated their life no longer hold the same power. This does not mean temptation disappears completely. The flesh remains part of the human condition, but its influence weakens as the Spirit grows stronger. Prayer becomes the place where this strengthening happens. It is the training ground where the soul learns how to depend on God rather than on impulse. Another way prayer weakens temptation is by redirecting the believer's desires. Temptation often works by promising satisfaction. It suggests that certain behaviors will bring happiness, relief, or fulfillment, but those promises are usually temporary and misleading. Prayer exposes that deception. When someone spends time with God, they experience a deeper kind of satisfaction, a peace that does not depend on circumstances, a sense of purpose that is not tied to external success, a joy that comes from alignment with God's will. These experiences gradually replace the false satisfaction offered by temptation. The believer begins to realize that what the flesh offers is shallow compared to the richness of God's presence. This realization changes the way temptation is perceived. Instead of feeling irresistible, it begins to look empty. What once seemed appealing now feels less important. What once felt urgent now appears temporary. Prayer reshapes desire itself. The heart starts longing for things that the flesh cannot provide. Truth instead of illusion, peace instead of chaos, integrity instead of compromise, love instead of selfishness. These new desires weaken the pull of temptation because the believer no longer finds the same satisfaction in the things the flesh promotes. The flesh understands this shift and tries to prevent it by discouraging prayer from the very beginning. It whispers that prayer is boring, ineffective, or unnecessary. It tells the believer that they can handle life on their own. But every time the believer chooses prayer despite those whispers, the balance of power begins to change. The spirit becomes stronger. The flesh becomes weaker. Temptation loses some of its influence. This process does not require perfection. Even imperfect prayer can strengthen the spirit. What matters most is persistence, returning to God day after day, bringing struggles honestly before Him, seeking His guidance in moments of weakness. Over time, this relationship transforms the believer from the inside out. Temptation may still appear, but it no longer feels like the controlling force it once was. The believer begins to live with greater freedom. Freedom from patterns that once defined their life. Freedom from impulses that once seemed impossible to resist. Freedom that grows from the quiet, consistent power of prayer. And this freedom is exactly what the flesh fears most. Prayer transfers authority from the flesh to the spirit. At the deepest level, the reason the flesh hates prayer is because prayer transfers authority. It shifts the center of control in a believer's life. Without prayer, the flesh tends to dominate decisions, emotions, and reactions. But when prayer becomes consistent, the Spirit begins to lead instead. This transfer of authority is one of the most profound transformations that can happen in the life of a believer. The flesh is naturally impulsive. It reacts quickly to circumstances. When something feels good, the flesh pursues it. When something feels threatening, the flesh reacts with fear or anger. When something appears difficult, the flesh often looks for the easiest escape. In contrast, the Spirit operates differently. The Spirit seeks alignment with God's wisdom rather than immediate emotional satisfaction. It considers long-term consequences rather than short-term comfort. It listens before acting. Prayer is the bridge that strengthens the voice of the Spirit. Without prayer, the voice of the flesh becomes louder because it is constantly stimulated by the world around us. Every day, the human mind absorbs countless influences, opinions, images, pressures, expectations, and desires. All of these influences feed the instincts of the flesh. But prayer interrupts that flow. When a believer prays, they step outside the noise of the world and reorient their heart toward God. They are no longer reacting to external pressures alone. Instead, they begin to seek God's perspective. This moment of reorientation slowly changes how a person lives. Instead of asking, "What do I feel like doing right now?" the believer begins asking, "What does God want me to do?" That question signals a transfer of authority. It means the flesh is no longer the ultimate decision-maker. The Spirit begins to take leadership. The Apostle Paul spoke about this transformation clearly in Romans 8. He wrote that those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Notice that Paul focuses on the mind. Authority is closely connected to what controls a person's thinking. Whatever dominates the mind eventually shapes behavior. If the mind is constantly filled with the desires of the flesh, those desires will guide decisions. But prayer reshapes the mind. In prayer, the believer brings their thoughts before God. They reflect on His truth. They surrender their worries, fears, and ambitions to Him. In doing so, their inner world begins to shift. Thought patterns change. Priorities realign. Emotions settle. The mind becomes less reactive and more attentive to God's direction. Over time, this mental transformation creates a new kind of authority within the believer's life. The Spirit begins guiding decisions that the flesh once controlled. Consider how this plays out in everyday situations. When someone speaks harshly, the flesh immediately wants to respond with equal intensity. It seeks to defend pride, to win the argument, to assert dominance. But a person who lives in prayer often experiences a different internal response. There is a pause, a moment of awareness, a quiet reminder of God's instruction to respond with patience or kindness. That pause represents the Spirit taking authority over the flesh. Without prayer, that pause rarely exists. Prayer creates the internal space where the Spirit can speak. Another example appears in moments of fear or uncertainty. The flesh often responds to fear by seeking control. It tries to manipulate outcomes, to predict every possible danger, or to escape the situation entirely. But prayer invites trust. When a believer brings their fears to God, they are acknowledging that ultimate control does not belong to them. This surrender weakens the flesh's need to dominate every circumstance. Instead of panic, the Spirit begins to cultivate peace. Instead of anxiety, the Spirit learns patience. This transformation does not mean that believers stop experiencing emotions or challenges. Rather, it means those emotions no longer dictate every decision. The Spirit becomes the guiding force, and that guidance grows stronger the more someone prays. One of the most beautiful aspects of prayer is that it does not only affect the moments when someone is actively speaking to God. Its influence spreads throughout the entire day. A person who begins the day with prayer carries that alignment into their interactions, responsibilities, and choices. Their heart remains oriented toward God, even while they are working, traveling, or speaking with others. In this way, prayer gradually transforms daily life into a continuous awareness of God's presence. The flesh hates this awareness because it limits its ability to operate unnoticed. The flesh thrives when the believer forgets God's presence. It gains influence when a person becomes spiritually distracted. But when someone lives with an ongoing sense of God's nearness, the opportunities for the flesh to dominate become fewer. This is why many spiritual teachers throughout history have emphasized the importance of daily prayer. Not because God requires ritual, but because prayer strengthens the Spirit's leadership. Every moment of prayer reinforces the believer's connection with God. Every conversation with Him deepens trust. Every act of surrender weakens the independence that the flesh tries to maintain. Over time, this process reshapes the believer's entire identity. They begin to see themselves not as individuals struggling alone, but as people walking with God. Their confidence grows not from personal strength, but from the assurance that God is guiding their path. This shift is powerful because it removes one of the flesh's greatest weapons: isolation. The flesh often convinces people that they must face life alone. It tells them that their problems are too complex, their weaknesses too strong, or their failures too severe. Prayer destroys that lie. In prayer, the believer encounters the truth that God is present, attentive, and willing to help. They discover that divine strength is available in moments of weakness. This discovery changes how they face life's challenges. Instead of relying solely on their own understanding, they begin to seek God's wisdom. Instead of carrying burdens alone, they bring those burdens into prayer. Instead of reacting to every situation impulsively, they pause and ask for guidance. Each of these choices reinforces the authority of the Spirit over the flesh. The flesh may still attempt to regain control. It will continue whispering excuses, offering distractions, and promoting self-reliance. But every time the believer returns to prayer, that influence weakens. Prayer becomes the place where authority is renewed. It is the place where the believer remembers who truly leads their life, not the impulses of the flesh, not the pressures of the world, but the Spirit of God. This is why the flesh fights prayer so intensely, because prayer changes who is in charge, and once the Spirit begins to lead, the power of the flesh can never fully reclaim its throne. The believer may still face struggles, but they now face them with a different authority guiding their path, the authority that comes from walking with God.